Tom and Sarah had been together for nearly 5 years, and a spontaneous road trip seemed like the perfect way to escape the stress of work and the daily grind. They decided to visit Sarah's parents, who lived in a small, sleepy town on the outskirts of a mountain range. It was late October, and the air had just started to cool, the vibrant autumn leaves swirling in the wind as they packed the car. The journey was supposed to take 6 hours, a straight drive through winding country roads and dense forests. As dusk began to fall, the couple found themselves deep in the heart of a wooded area with no signs of civilization in sight. The trees on either side of the narrow road loomed tall and dark, their branches like twisted hands stretching towards the sky. The atmosphere inside the car was peaceful, though. They played music, joked about silly things, and planned their weekend ahead. As the sky dimmed to a deep purple, Tom noticed a figure standing at the edge of the road in the distance. "Look at that," he said, squinting as the car drew closer. "A hitchhiker." Sure enough, a man stood by the roadside, his thumb out, hoping for a ride. He looked young, in his early 20s perhaps, wearing a tattered jacket and faded jeans. His backpack sat at his feet, and though the light was fading fast, Tom could make out the hopeful expression on the man's face. "Should we stop?" Tom asked, glancing over at Sarah. Sarah hesitated. She didn't like the idea of picking up strangers, especially in such a remote area. But the sun was setting fast, and the thought of leaving someone stranded in the middle of nowhere tugged at her conscience. "I guess," she replied slowly, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. But just for a short while. Tom pulled over, the car slowing to a stop a few feet ahead of the man. The hitchhiker jogged up to the passenger window, his smile wide and grateful. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his breath fogging up the cool glass. "I'm heading to the next town. Just a short ride, if that's okay." "Sure, hop in the back," Tom said, unlocking the doors. The hitchhiker slid into the back seat, his backpack resting at his feet. He introduced himself as David, his voice calm and polite. "I've been walking for hours," he explained. "Figured I'd give hitchhiking a try since the town's still a few miles out." Tom and Sarah made small talk with him as they drove. David seemed friendly enough, though something about him felt slightly off to Sarah. His answers to their questions were vague, and he often avoided eye contact. She chalked it up to the fact that he was probably tired, perhaps a bit anxious from having to rely on strangers for a ride. As the conversation dwindled, an eerie silence filled the car. The night outside grew darker, and the road seemed to stretch on endlessly through the woods. Every now and then, Tom would glance in the rearview mirror, catching sight of David sitting quietly in the back seat, staring out the window. He looked distant, as if his mind was somewhere far away. After about 20 minutes, Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something wasn't right. She turned around to ask David where exactly he needed to be dropped off, but the words caught in her throat. The back seat was empty. Sarah blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. "Tom," she whispered, her voice shaky. "He's gone." Tom glanced at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "He's right." He stopped mid-sentence, looking in the rearview mirror, his face draining of color. The hitchhiker had vanished. The car had not stopped. No doors had opened, and there was no sound. Nothing to indicate he had left. He was simply gone. Tom slammed on the brakes, pulling the car over to the side of the road. They both jumped out, frantically searching the back seat, but there was no sign of David. His backpack was gone, and there was no trace of him anywhere. They checked the road behind them, the dense woods on either side, but it was as if he had disappeared into thin air. In the back seat, the only thing left behind was an old weathered jacket. It looked ancient, the fabric worn and frayed at the edges, as if it had been left there for decades. Sarah reached into the pocket and pulled out a postcard, yellowed with age. The ink on it smudged and faded. It read in shaky handwriting, "I'll never make it home." Shaken, Sarah and Tom hurried back into the car and sped down the road, neither of them saying a word. The silence between them was thick with fear and confusion. Who was David? Where had he gone? And how had he vanished without a trace? When they finally reached Sarah's parents' house late that night, they were too rattled to explain what had happened. They went to bed, but Sarah couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with questions and dread. In the early hours of the morning, after tossing and turning, She decided to search online for any information about the stretch of road they had traveled. What she found sent chills down her spine. Decades ago, a young man named David had died in a tragic accident on that very stretch of road. He had been hitchhiking home when he was struck by a car late at night. Witnesses had reported seeing him walking along the road just minutes before his death. Since then, many travelers had claimed to have picked up a hitchhiker matching his description, only for him to vanish from their car before reaching his destination. Sarah quickly closed her laptop, her hands trembling. She looked over at Tom, who was still asleep, unaware of the unsettling discovery she had just made. The jacket was still in the back seat of their car, a haunting reminder of the hitchhiker who had vanished without a trace. For the rest of the trip, neither Tom nor Sarah mentioned the hitchhiker again. They both knew that some things were better left unexplained, but every time they passed by that road, a chill would run down their spines, and they would both glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see David sitting in the back seat once more, waiting for a ride that he would never finish. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive across the country. A group of friends, Mike, Lisa, Jake, and Emily, had packed up their car, eager to make it to the West Coast before the weekend was over. They had been driving for hours, their spirits high, fueled by fast food and loud music. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the endless highway, when the gas gauge dipped dangerously close to empty. "We need to stop soon," Mike, who was driving, said, his voice edged with concern as he tapped the gauge. "We've been in the middle of nowhere for miles." Lisa, sitting in the passenger seat, scrolled through her phone, looking for the nearest gas station. "There's nothing around here for at least another 50 miles, she replied, squinting at the screen. Just as they were about to consider their options, Jake, sitting in the back seat, pointed out a sign they were approaching. "Look, there's a station up ahead. Turn off here," he said. Sure enough, a weathered old sign, barely visible through the encroaching twilight, pointed them toward a narrow, isolated road. The sign read, "Gas. Next stop 2 miles." It looked old, the paint peeling, but they had little choice. The road wound through desolate stretches of barren land, and the further they drove, the more isolated it felt. The landscape was flat, stretching out in every direction, with not a house or building in sight. Just as they began to wonder if the sign had been wrong, the gas station came into view. It was a small, decrepit building, with a single flickering neon light casting an eerie glow over 2 rusty gas pumps. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just the station sitting ominously in the middle of nowhere. "Creepy," Emily muttered from the back seat, her voice uneasy. Mike pulled up to the pumps, the car's headlights barely illuminating the station's grimy exterior. "We don't have a choice," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We need gas." As they stepped out of the car, the air felt heavy, unnaturally still. Lisa wrinkled her nose at the smell. Something metallic and decaying lingered in the air. The station looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were covered in dirt, and the door to the small convenience store hung crookedly on its hinges. There was no one at the counter, no attendants in sight. "I'll pump the gas," Mike said, walking over to the pump. "Someone should go inside and see if they take cards or if we need to pay cash." Lisa, still uneasy, nodded and headed towards the store. She pushed open the creaky door, the bell above it jingling ominously. Inside, the shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty cans and faded wrappers, the dim light casting long shadows across the floor. The counter was empty, but a small silver bell sat atop it. She rang it once, the sound echoing unnervingly in the otherwise silent room. After a few moments, a figure emerged from the back room. The man who stepped out looked off. His clothes were old and greasy, hanging loosely on his lanky frame, and his skin seemed unnaturally pale. His eyes, dark and sunken, met hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Need help?" he asked, his voice gravelly and slow, as though it hadn't been used in years. We need gas. Do you take cards?" Lisa stammered, her discomfort growing. The man's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "Cash only. Pumps out there are old. Cards don't work." Lisa nodded, her throat dry. "Okay, I'll be right back." As she turned to leave, she noticed something strange. Behind the counter, partially obscured by a curtain, she saw another figure, a woman standing still, her back to the room. Something about her posture was unnatural, rigid, as though she wasn't breathing. Lisa's stomach twisted as she quickly exited the store, feeling the man's eyes on her the entire way. When she got back to the car, Mike was still trying to figure out how to work the ancient pump. "They only take cash," she said, her voice shaky. "What's wrong?" Jake asked, noticing the look on her face. "Something's not right," she whispered, glancing back at the store. The guy inside, there's something off about him. And there was someone else in there, just standing there. Mike, now growing uneasy himself, gave up on the pump and called it off. "Let's just get out of here. We'll find another station." They quickly piled back into the car, but when Mike turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. He tried again, but the car refused to start. Panic began to settle in. No, this can't be happening," Mike muttered, slamming his fist on the steering wheel. "Maybe it's just the battery?" Jake offered, though he didn't sound convinced. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the driver's side window. Mike jumped, turning to see the man from inside the store standing right outside the car, his face eerily close to the glass. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice muffled through the window, but still dripping with something sinister. No, we're fine," Mike said, his heart racing as he locked the doors. The man's smile widened. "Why don't you all come inside? It's not safe out here at night." His words sent a chill down their spines, and as he stepped back, they noticed something else. More figures were emerging from the darkness around the station. Shadowy figures, all dressed similarly to the man, began to circle the car, their movements slow and deliberate. The woman from inside the store now stood in the doorway, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide and glassy. "Drive, just drive!" Lisa screamed, but the car wouldn't budge. In a moment of desperation, Mike jumped out, intending to run. But before he could make it far, one of the attendants grabbed him. The grip was like iron, and Mike's screams filled the air as he was dragged toward the store. Jake, Lisa, and Emily watched in horror, too terrified to move as the figures closed in. The attendants weren't ordinary people. Something was horribly wrong with them. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their movements unnatural, like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. As the friends tried to flee, the night echoed with their screams. One by one, they were pulled into the darkness by the gas station's sinister attendants. Their final moments were filled with terror, trapped in the middle of nowhere with no escape. The next morning, the gas station stood as it always had, abandoned and quiet. No sign of the travelers remained, just the rusting pumps and the flickering neon sign, waiting for the next unlucky souls to stop by. Highway 16, a lonely stretch of road winding through the rugged wilderness of British Columbia, Canada, is known for its breathtaking views of vast forests and towering mountains. Yet for all its natural beauty, the highway harbors a dark secret, one that has haunted the region for decades. It is a place where people vanish without a trace. Dubbed the Highway of Tears, this remote road has become synonymous with mysterious disappearances, unsolved murders, and a growing list of missing women and girls, most of whom are indigenous. The first disappearance on Highway 16 dates back to 1969, when 25-year-old Gloria Moody, an indigenous woman, went missing after a night out in Williams Lake, a town not far from the highway. She'd been seen walking along the road the following day, but she never made it home. Her body was found days later, abandoned in the wilderness, and her killer was never caught. This was the beginning of a dark chapter in Canadian history that would stretch on for over half a century. As the years passed, more women and girls began to disappear along the same highway, often under eerily similar circumstances. They would be last seen hitchhiking, walking home from school, or traveling between the small towns that dot the route. Many were young, their whole lives ahead of them, until they vanished into the cold, unforgiving expanse of the Canadian wilderness. One of the most well-known cases was that of 15-year-old Ramona Wilson, a bright and caring teenager who disappeared in 1994. Ramona had been planning to visit a friend in Smithers, a small town along Highway 16, but she never made it. Her mother grew concerned when Ramona didn't come home, but days turned into weeks, and weeks into months with no word from her. It wasn't until nearly a year later that her body was found in a wooded area near the highway, her remains partially concealed by the thick underbrush. Despite intensive investigations, Ramona's killer was never identified, and her case remains unsolved to this day. The stories of those who vanished share a chilling pattern. Many of the women were indigenous, and they often disappeared while traveling between isolated communities along Highway 16. The authorities frequently dismissed their cases, assuming the women had run away or left voluntarily, despite their families' insistence that something far more sinister had happened. The harsh, remote landscape made searches difficult, and many of the missing were never found, leaving their loved ones in a perpetual state of anguish. One such case is that of Nicole Hoare, a non-Indigenous woman who vanished in 2002 while hitchhiking to visit friends. Nicole had been working as a tree planter, a common summer job for young Canadians, and was last seen near a gas station along Highway 16. She had planned to catch a ride to Smithers, but she never arrived. Her disappearance sparked a media frenzy, and search teams scoured the area, but no trace of Nicole was ever found. Her case brought renewed attention to the disappearances along Highway 16, but still, answers remained elusive. The mysterious disappearances continued, year after year, with no solid leads, no suspects, and no answers. Families of the missing women were left to grapple with their loss, haunted by the knowledge that their daughters, sisters, and mothers had vanished on a highway that seemed to swallow them whole. For the indigenous communities along Highway 16, the disappearances were a painful reminder of a long history of marginalization and neglect. Many felt that the authorities were not taking the cases seriously because the majority of the victims were Indigenous women. They called it an epidemic, a national crisis that was being ignored. In response to the growing public outcry, a symposium was held in 2006 to address the issue. It brought together law enforcement, community leaders, and the families of the missing women. The event was a turning point, and the Highway of Tears investigation was formally launched. Authorities began re-examining cold cases, and more resources were devoted to solving the disappearances. But despite renewed efforts, the highway continued to claim victims. The terrain around Highway 16 is vast and unforgiving. The dense forests stretch for miles, broken only by rivers, cliffs, and the occasional logging road. It is easy for someone to disappear without a trace in such a place. And for those who live in the small towns along the highway, there is always an undercurrent of fear. Hitchhiking is a way of life for many, especially in rural areas where public transportation is sparse, but it also makes people vulnerable. The isolation, the long stretches of road without any signs of life, everything about the highway feels both beautiful and dangerous. In recent years, the Canadian government has made efforts to improve safety along Highway 16. Bus services were introduced to reduce the need for hitchhiking, and a dedicated task force was formed to investigate the disappearances. But for the families of the missing, these actions, while welcome, came too late. The trauma of not knowing what happened to their loved ones, of not having closure, is something that will never fade. Among the more recent cases is the 2011 disappearance of Madison Scott, a vibrant 20-year-old who had gone camping with friends near Vanderhoof, a town along Highway 16. After a night of partying, her friends left the campsite, but Madison stayed behind, planning to sleep in her tent by the lake. When her friends returned the next day, Madison was gone. Her truck and tent were still at the campsite, but there was no sign of her. Search teams scoured the area for days, but Madison's fate remains a mystery. The Highway of Tears stretches over 700 kilometers, and over the years, it has become a place of sorrow and loss. It's not just a road, it's a symbol of a tragic, ongoing story. The indigenous communities hold vigils, walk the highway, and fight for justice. The names of the missing and murdered women are etched into their hearts, their faces remembered through old photos and fading memories. Though there have been some breakthroughs in the cases, DNA evidence, suspects, and the occasional arrest, the majority of these disappearances remain unsolved. For the families, there is no peace. As they drive down the endless winding road, they look into the shadows of the forest, hoping for answers that may never come. Highway 16, the Highway of Tears, stands as a reminder of the missing, the murdered, and the unanswered questions that continue to haunt the wilderness of British Columbia. It was a cool autumn evening when Sarah first saw the car. She had been driving alone, heading back to her hometown after visiting friends in a neighboring city. The road was mostly empty, a long and lonely stretch of highway that cut through miles of dark, dense woods. The headlights of her car illuminated the narrow two-lane road, and aside from the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind, the world around her was silent. The journey was peaceful at first. The sky had turned an inky black, with stars twinkling above the treetops, and Sarah felt the familiar comfort of the open road. But then, in her rearview mirror, she noticed something strange. A pair of headlights far behind her, growing brighter. She didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just another car on the road. But as the minutes passed, the car remained behind her, its headlights unwavering, not speeding up or slowing down, just following. She glanced back again, expecting the vehicle to overtake her. But it didn't. The car stayed at a distance, its lights flickering faintly in her rearview mirror. It was too far away to make out the details, but something about it gave her an uneasy feeling. The road was deserted, no other cars in sight, and the thought of being followed sent a chill down her spine. As the road twisted and turned through the forest, the car behind her followed every movement, matching her speed exactly. Sarah tapped the gas pedal, accelerating slightly. The car did the same. She slowed down, hoping it would pass her, but it only slowed down too, maintaining the same unsettling distance. Now fully on edge, Sarah strained her eyes to get a better look at the car. It was old, an old beat-up sedan from what she could tell, with a rusted frame and headlights that flickered as if they might go out at any moment. The car seemed out of place, almost like it didn't belong on the road. But there it was, trailing her without fail. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her heart beginning to race. Why wasn't it passing? Why was it staying behind her for so long? After another 10 minutes of this bizarre game of cat and mouse, Sarah made a decision. She'd take the next exit and see if the car followed her. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a harmless driver on the same route. But something deep inside told her it was more than that. She spotted a sign for an exit ahead, a small detour that led to a scenic lookout point. It was a sharp turn off the main highway, and she signaled her intention to exit, slowing down as she veered off the road. She watched the mirror intently, half expecting the old car to continue on the highway. But to her horror, it took the exit too. The car's headlights grew closer now, as if it had sped up after making the turn. Sarah's breathing became shallow as fear took hold. She pressed the gas pedal hard, accelerating down the narrow, winding road. The car behind her did the same, its old engine rumbling loudly in the night air. She pushed the car faster, navigating the sharp bends of the lookout road as best as she could. The road climbed a steep hill, with the dark forest on either side closing in, making her feel trapped. As she reached the top, the road opened up to a large gravel parking lot that overlooked a deep ravine below. She pulled into the lot, tires skidding on the gravel, and came to an abrupt stop. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the car in her rear-view mirror, expecting it to pull in behind her, but instead, it did something even more unsettling. The car stopped just before the entrance to the parking lot, its headlights flickering. It sat there idling, the engine's low growl echoing through the stillness of the night. For a few long, agonizing moments, it didn't move. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, without warning, the car's lights went out. The road fell into complete darkness. Sarah squinted, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had the driver turned off the car? Were they waiting for her in the dark? Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone, ready to call for help. But when she looked up again, the car was gone. No sound of an engine, no sign of movement, just gone. Panicking, she fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She quickly called her friend, her voice shaky as she tried to explain what had just happened. "It was right there," she said, glancing back down the road. I swear it was following me, but now it's gone. Just gone. Her friend tried to calm her down, reassuring her that it was probably nothing, but Sarah knew what she had seen. She wasn't imagining things. That car had been real, and it had vanished without a trace. After calming down enough to drive again, she cautiously made her way back to the highway, glancing in her mirrors the entire time. There was no sign of the car. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the memory of that night haunted her. Days later, still unsettled by the experience, Sarah decided to do some research. She scoured local forums and online discussion boards, hoping to find someone who might have had a similar encounter. What she found chilled her to the bone. There were countless stories about an old, beat-up sedan that followed drivers along that same stretch of road. People described the car as appearing out of nowhere, tailing them for miles, only to vanish without explanation. Some said the car was a relic from decades ago, a vehicle involved in a fatal accident on that very highway. Others believed it was a ghostly apparition, doomed to forever roam the roads, seeking vengeance or closure. One story in particular stood out. Decades ago, a young couple had been driving down the highway late at night when they were chased by a car matching the description Sarah had seen. The car had forced them off the road, sending them crashing into the ravine near the lookout point. Both of them died on impact, and since then, drivers reported seeing the phantom car on the same stretch of road. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had come face to face with that very car, the phantom car that haunted Highway 16. And though she never saw it again, she couldn't forget the way it had followed her relentlessly, only to disappear into the night like it had never been there at all. To this day, drivers on that desolate stretch of highway report strange encounters with an old beat-up car, following them for miles before vanishing into thin air. Some believe it's a ghost, others think it's a warning, but one thing is certain: those who encounter it are left with a chilling reminder that not everything on the road is what it seems. It was well past midnight when Jack decided to pull off the highway. He had been driving for hours, his eyes heavy with fatigue, the hypnotic hum of the road making it difficult to stay focused. He was on his way to visit his sister in a small town several hours away, but exhaustion was getting the better of him. His phone's GPS indicated a rest stop a few miles ahead, and though the idea of stopping at such a desolate place unnerved him, he had little choice. His eyelids were growing heavier by the minute. The rest stop appeared as a small, dimly lit area just off the highway, surrounded by thick trees that loomed like dark sentinels in the night. It looked old and neglected, with faded signs and cracked pavement. A single flickering streetlight illuminated the otherwise pitch-black lot, casting eerie shadows on the empty picnic tables and vending machines that had long since fallen into disrepair. Jack pulled into the lot, parking his car beneath the dim light. He glanced around. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. He considered driving on, but his eyes burned with fatigue, and he knew he couldn't safely continue without a quick nap. The rest stop was deserted, and though it gave him the creeps, it seemed safe enough for a short break. He locked his doors, reclined his seat, and closed his eyes, hoping to catch a few minutes of rest before getting back on the road. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional distant call of an owl. Despite the eerie atmosphere, sleep overtook him quickly. Jack wasn't sure how long he had been asleep when he was jolted awake by a sound. At first, he thought it was part of a dream, a soft, scraping noise like something brushing against metal. Groggy, he blinked his eyes open and sat up, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He listened intently, holding his breath. There it was again, scrape, scrape. Something or someone was outside his car. His pulse quickened as he scanned the dimly lit parking lot. The flickering streetlight made it hard to see clearly, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on his eyes. For a moment he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then his heart stopped. Just outside his driver's side window, barely visible in the faint light, stood a figure. The person was tall and motionless, their face obscured by the shadows. They were standing so still that Jack almost thought they were a statue. But then he saw the glint of movement, the figure's hand slowly dragging something sharp across the side of his car. Scrape, scrape. Panic surged through Jack. He tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a vagrant, someone harmless. But deep down, he knew something was very wrong. His hand instinctively reached for the ignition, but he hesitated, his eyes locked on the figure. The intruder had stopped scraping the car and was now just standing there, watching. Jack couldn't see the person's face, but he could feel their eyes on him, studying him. The figure's stillness was unnerving, their silence even more so. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, as if waiting for Jack to make the first move. His breath caught in his throat as the figure suddenly crouched down, disappearing from view. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't see the person anymore, but he could hear them. Soft footsteps moving around the car, slowly, deliberately. Jack's hand fumbled for his phone, but in his panic he dropped it on the floor. He cursed under his breath, bending down to retrieve it. As he lifted the phone back into his hand, his stomach twisted in horror. The figure had reappeared, now standing directly in front of the car. In the dim light, Jack could make out more details. The person was wearing a long, dark coat, their face still hidden in shadow. But it was the way they stood, so unnaturally still, their posture rigid and unnatural, that sent a wave of dread through him. Without thinking, Jack started the car. The engine roared to life, shattering the eerie silence. For a moment he thought the figure would back away, that they would retreat into the shadows where they came from. But they didn't move. Jack's hands trembled as he shifted into reverse, his eyes locked on the figure. As he began to back out of the parking spot, the figure finally moved, slowly, methodically. They walked around to the passenger side of the car, their hand trailing along the hood as they moved. Jack's mind raced. Why weren't they running? What did they want? Then, to his horror, the figure reached for the passenger door handle and pulled. The door didn't budge. Jack had locked it. But the sight of the figure trying to enter his car sent him into full-blown panic. He slammed the car into drive, tires screeching as he sped out of the parking lot, the car lurching onto the dark highway. His heart raced as he glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure running after him. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the fading light of the rest stop behind him. The figure had vanished. For a few minutes, Jack drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He kept checking the mirrors, half expecting the intruder to appear behind him, but the road remained empty. The further he drove, the more he began to question what had just happened. Who was that person? Why were they trying to break into his car? And where had they gone? After several minutes, Jack's breathing finally began to steady, though the fear still clung to him. He decided to pull over at the next gas station, needing a moment to collect himself and call for help. A few miles down the road, he spotted a well-lit truck stop and pulled in, parking near the entrance. He sat in the car for a moment, trying to calm his nerves before he reached for his phone again. This time he dialed his sister, his fingers trembling as he held the phone to his ear. "Hey, you okay?" she answered, sensing the tension in his voice. I don't know," Jack said, glancing around the brightly lit gas station. "Something happened. I think someone tried to break into my car at the rest stop." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What? Are you okay? Did you call the police?" "I didn't see a face," Jack continued, his voice shaky. "But they were just standing there, watching me. And then they tried to open the door." His sister urged him to call the police, but Jack wasn't sure what he would even tell them. He hadn't seen the person clearly, and by the time he'd driven away, they had disappeared. He agreed to call, but deep down, he felt like it wouldn't matter. Whoever it was had been there one moment and gone the next, like a phantom in the night. Jack never did see the intruder again, but the memory of that night stayed with him. For months, he avoided driving late at night and refused to stop at any rest areas alone. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unlucky traveler to pull off the highway into that desolate rest stop, unaware of the terror waiting just outside their window. To this day, whenever he drives past an abandoned rest stop in the dead of night, Jack feels a chill run down his spine. He locks his doors tight and keeps his eyes forward, refusing to look in the rearview mirror, fearing that one day the figure might return. It was supposed to be the road trip of a lifetime. 5 friends, Ben, Lily, Tom, Jessica, and Mark, had packed their bags, loaded up an old SUV, and set out on a journey to explore the vast, winding highways of the American Southwest. The trip had been going smoothly for the first few days, filled with laughter, music, and breathtaking scenery. But everything changed when they took a wrong turn late one afternoon, deep in the desert. The group had been following the directions on Lily's phone, hoping to cut through a stretch of desert to reach their next destination, a small town with a famous roadside diner. But as they drove, the GPS signal became spotty, and the road they were on seemed to get narrower and less maintained. By the time they realized they had made a mistake, the sun was already sinking below the horizon, and the surrounding desert was bathed in the eerie glow of twilight. "We should turn back," Jessica suggested from the back seat, her voice uneasy as she looked out at the barren landscape. "This doesn't feel right." Ben, who was driving, glanced at the dashboard. "We're low on gas. If we go back now, we might not make it to a station." He sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "We'll just keep going a little longer. There has to be something up ahead." The road was cracked and uneven, lined with jagged rocks and twisted desert plants. After what felt like hours of driving through the desolate landscape, the group spotted something in the distance. An old wooden sign, barely legible in the fading light. "Dry Creek," Lily read aloud. "Population, 37. "That's it?" Tom asked, peering over her shoulder. "There's only 37 people here?" "It's probably one of those ghost towns," Ben replied. "But maybe they'll have a gas station or somewhere we can stay the night. It's getting late." Reluctantly, the group agreed to continue into the town, though a sense of unease had settled over them. The road narrowed even further as they drove into the town, a collection of rundown buildings and old dilapidated homes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The place was dead silent, save for the occasional gust of wind that rattled loose shutters and sent dust swirling through the streets. As they pulled into what appeared to be the town's main square, the first thing they noticed was the absence of people. There were no cars, no movement, no lights in the windows, just an unsettling stillness. "This is creepy," Mark muttered from the back seat. "Where is everyone?" "Let's just find a gas station and get out of here," Lily said, her voice tight with anxiety. Ben pulled the SUV into what looked like an old general store. The faded sign above the door was barely readable, but the structure looked like it might have been open at some point in the last century. He killed the engine, and the group stepped out of the car, the silence pressing down on them like a heavy weight. "Should we split up and look around?" Ben suggested. "Maybe someone's inside one of these buildings." "I'm not sure that's a good idea," Jessica said, her eyes darting around the deserted town. "I don't like this place." But before anyone could respond, they heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from behind one of the nearby buildings. The friends turned as one, their hearts pounding in their chests. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with leathery skin that looked like it had been scorched by years in the desert sun. He wore tattered clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his eyes, but something about him was deeply unsettling. "You folks lost?" the man asked, his voice gravelly and low. He didn't smile. Yeah," Ben replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We were just looking for some gas. Do you know where we can find a station?" The man stared at them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Ain't no gas here," he finally said. "Ain't been none in a long time." "Well, is there anywhere we can stay for the night?" Lily asked, her voice strained with growing apprehension. The man's lips twisted into what might have been a smile, though it felt more like a sneer. "Town's full. No room for outsiders." "Full?" Tom said incredulously, glancing around the empty streets. "This place looks abandoned." The man took a step closer, his presence menacing. "Ain't abandoned. People here just don't take kindly to strangers." An icy wave of fear washed over the group. Something was terribly wrong. The town wasn't just abandoned. It felt trapped in time, haunted by the few souls who remained. Ben cleared his throat. "We'll just head back then. Thanks for your help." The man's eyes glinted in the fading light. "Ain't no heading back. Once you're in Dry Creek, you don't leave." The words sent a cold shiver down their spines. Ben quickly ushered everyone back to the car, trying to hide his panic. "Let's go," he muttered. But when he turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine sputtered but refused to start. "No, no, no," Ben frantically tried again, but the SUV remained silent, as if it too had succumbed to the eerie spell of the town. "Well, is there anywhere we can stay for the night?" Lily asked, her voice strained with growing apprehension. The man's lips twisted into what might have been a smile, though it felt more like a sneer. "Town's full, no room for outsiders." "Full?" Tom said incredulously, glancing around the empty streets. "This place looks abandoned." The man took a step closer, his presence menacing. "Ain't abandoned. People here just don't take kindly to strangers." An icy wave of fear washed over the group. Something was terribly wrong. The town wasn't just abandoned. It felt trapped in time, haunted by the few souls who remained. Ben cleared his throat. "We'll just head back then. Thanks for your help." The man's eyes glinted in the fading light. "Ain't no heading back. Once you're in Dry Creek, you don't leave." The words sent a cold shiver down their spines. Ben quickly ushered everyone back to the car, trying to hide his panic. "Let's go," he muttered. But when he turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine sputtered but refused to start. "No, no, no," Ben frantically tried again, but the SUV remained silent, as if it too had succumbed to the eerie spell of the town. The door creaked as they pushed it open, and they hurried inside, slamming it shut behind them. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of rot clung to the air. The church was as dilapidated as the rest of the town, its pews broken and its windows shattered. "We can't stay here," Tom said, his voice shaky. "They'll find us." "We don't have a choice," Ben replied, glancing out one of the shattered windows. The figures were gathering outside, slowly closing in. "We have to fight," Mark said, his voice determined but fearful. "We can't just let them take us." Lily shook her head, tears in her eyes. "There's too many of them." Before they could formulate a plan, the door creaked open and the man from the gas station stepped inside, followed by the others. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The look in their eyes said it all. The friends weren't leaving Dry Creek alive. As the group backed into a corner, surrounded by the hostile townspeople, the reality of their situation hit them hard. This was no ordinary town. It was a trap, a place lost in time, sustained by the fear and lives of those who made the mistake of stumbling upon it. In that moment, they realized something even more horrifying. They were not the first, and they wouldn't be the last. The last thing they heard before darkness claimed them was the sound of the door slamming shut, sealing their fate in the ghostly town of Dry Creek, where no one ever left, and no one ever would. It was supposed to be just another leg of their cross-country road trip. Julie, Aaron, Megan, and Chris had been traveling together for over a week, exploring small towns and scenic highways, enjoying the freedom of the open road. They were all close friends, excited to make memories and experience the unexpected. But none of them could have anticipated the terror that awaited them one chilly night in the remote stretches of the countryside. The group had spent the day hiking in a national park and were now exhausted, ready to find a motel for the night. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep indigo, and the winding, narrow road they were on seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark, desolate landscape. Trees lined both sides of the road, their twisted branches arching overhead, creating a tunnel of shadows. Aaron, who was driving, squinted at the dashboard. "We're running low on gas. We'll need to stop soon," he said, his voice a little strained. "Anyone see any signs for a gas station?" "Nope," Megan replied from the back seat, scrolling through her phone. "And I've lost signal out here. I can't pull up any maps." Chris leaned forward, looking out the window at the dense forest that seemed to press in on them. "We're in the middle of nowhere. We should have filled up when we had the chance." Julie glanced out her window, feeling a growing unease. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around them, and there wasn't a single other car on the road. They hadn't seen any signs of life for miles. "Let's just keep an eye out. There's bound to be something up ahead," she said. though her words felt hollow even to her. As they continued driving, the mood in the car grew tense. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. The road was deserted, and the headlights illuminated little more than the narrow strip of asphalt ahead of them. Then, out of the darkness, Aaron saw something up ahead. He slowed the car. "Wait, is that someone on the side of the road?" Megan leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "Looks like a couple of kids." Sure enough, two figures stood just off the road, barely visible in the dim light. As the car approached, it became clear they were children, two of them, a boy and a girl, standing eerily still side by side. They couldn't have been older than 10 or 12. The girl had long dark hair, and the boy wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face. The car rolled to a stop a few yards away, and Aaron kept the engine running, glancing at the others. Should we stop? They look like they need help. Julie's gut reaction was to say no. Something about the scene felt wrong. It wasn't just the late hour or the remote location. It was the way the children were standing, completely motionless, as if they'd been waiting for them. "I don't know, Aaron, this is giving me the creeps," she said. "We can't just leave them here," Chris argued, though his voice was hesitant. "What if they're lost?" Reluctantly, Aaron lowered the window, calling out to the children. "Hey, you guys okay? Do you need help?" For a moment, the children didn't respond. They stood there staring at the car. Then slowly, they began to walk toward the vehicle, their movements deliberate, almost unnatural. "They're coming over," Megan said, her voice a whisper. "This is weird." As the children approached, the group felt an overwhelming sense of unease. When the kids finally reached the car, the girl was the first to speak. Her voice was soft, almost robotic, lacking the emotion one would expect from a child in need. "We need a ride. Our parents are waiting for us." Aaron hesitated, his hand still on the steering wheel. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. "Where are your parents?" he asked, glancing around, though there was nothing but the dark forest in every direction. "They're just down the road," the boy said, his voice equally flat, devoid of any inflection. "Please let us in. It's not safe out here." Julie felt her heart racing. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the children spoke, but what truly sent a wave of terror through her was when the girl looked up at her through the window. Julie gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The girl's eyes were completely black, no whites, no iris, just inky black orbs that reflected the car's headlights in a strange, unnatural way. The boy's eyes were the same, dark, endless voids that seemed to suck in all the light around them. "Oh my God," Megan whispered, pulling back from the window, her face pale. "What's wrong with their eyes?" Chris, who had been leaning forward, jerked back in his seat, his pulse quickening. "Don't open the door, Aaron," he said, his voice shaky. "Don't let them in." Aaron was frozen, his hand trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. The children didn't move, their black eyes fixed on the group, unblinking, as they stood eerily still beside the car. "Please," the girl repeated, her voice chillingly calm. "We need a ride." "No," Julie whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. "No way." The atmosphere inside the car had shifted from tension to outright fear. Every instinct in Julie's body screamed that they needed to get away from these children, these things, whatever they were. "Aaron, go," Megan urged, her voice trembling. "Drive, just drive." But the children weren't giving up. The boy leaned closer to the window, his voice taking on an edge of insistence. "We can't come in unless you invite us. Let us in." That was it. Julie felt a surge of panic, unlike anything she had ever experienced before. She reached over, grabbing Aaron's arm. "Go, now!" Aaron didn't need to be told again. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the SUV lurched forward, speeding away from the children. As the car roared down the road, Julie looked back, her heart pounding in her ears. The children were still standing there, watching them, their black eyes glowing faintly in the rearview mirror. No one spoke for several minutes. The silence in the car was thick with fear. Finally, Aaron broke it, his voice shaky. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Megan whispered, still pale, her hands trembling. "But those weren't normal kids. Did you see their eyes? They were black," Chris finished for her. "Completely black. What were they?" "I don't know," Julie said, her voice barely a whisper. "But they wanted to get in the car. and they weren't going to leave until we let them. As they drove deeper into the night, the road seemed endless, the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. The strange encounter had left them shaken to the core. There were no more jokes, no more laughter, only a deep, unsettling silence. After what felt like hours, they finally found a gas station. They pulled in, still rattled, and sat in the car for a moment, catching their breath. The safety of the brightly lit station offered little comfort. "Should we tell someone about this?" Aaron asked, glancing at the others. Julie shook her head. "What are we going to say? That we saw some creepy kids with black eyes in the middle of nowhere? They'll think we're crazy." The group filled up the tank and got back on the road, each of them haunted by what had happened. They didn't talk about it for the rest of the trip, but the memory lingered like a dark cloud over them. Years later, Julie would sometimes think back to that night, wondering what would have happened if they had let the children into the car. She was grateful they hadn't, but the unanswered questions still haunted her. Who or what had those children been? And why did it feel like they were still out there somewhere, waiting for another group of travelers to cross their path? One thing was certain. Whatever those children were, they weren't human. And they weren't looking for a ride. They were looking for something far more sinister. Katie had been driving for hours. The sun had set long ago, and the dark, winding road through the countryside seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of her. She had been visiting her family in a small town 2 states over, and now she was on her way back home, hoping to make it before midnight. It had been a long and tiring day, and the monotony of the road was starting to wear on her. The occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse or the rustling of leaves in the breeze were the only reminders that she wasn't completely alone on the empty highway. Her car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow road ahead, bordered by dense woods. The radio played softly in the background, though Katie had stopped paying attention to it a while ago. She was eager to get home, to climb into her own bed and sleep off the fatigue of the long drive. As she continued driving, Katie noticed a strange feeling creeping over her, a growing sense of unease. She couldn't quite place it, but something felt off. She glanced at the rearview mirror, out of habit more than anything, and saw only the empty road behind her. Yet, despite the lack of any immediate threat, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. She had been on the road for hours, and fatigue was likely playing tricks on her, she thought. But then, as she passed a lonely gas station on the side of the road, the faint flicker of its lights made her stomach turn. She realized she hadn't stopped for gas in a while, and should probably fill up soon before she got stranded in the middle of nowhere. A few miles later, Katie spotted a small rest stop ahead. It was a run-down little place with a single gas pump and a flickering overhead light. A dingy sign read, "Open 24 hours," though the place looked as though it hadn't seen much business in years. She debated whether to keep driving and hope for a bigger station, but the gas gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty. Reluctantly, she pulled in, her tires crunching over the gravel as she came to a stop next to the pump. The place was eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of crickets breaking the silence. Katie stepped out of the car, the night air cool against her skin. She swiped her card at the pump and began fueling the car, glancing around uneasily. The gas station's windows were dark, and there was no sign of anyone inside. The pump ticked away slowly, and Katie found herself growing more anxious by the minute. The feeling of being watched intensified, though she couldn't see anyone or anything around. She tried to brush it off as irrational paranoia, but the sensation wouldn't leave her. Finally, the pump clicked, signaling that her tank was full. Katie quickly replaced the nozzle and got back into the car, locking the doors behind her. She exhaled, relieved to be inside again, and prepared to get back on the road. As she shifted the car into drive, something caught her eye in the rearview mirror, something that made her heart stop. There was a shadow in the back seat. Her blood turned to ice. For a split second, she thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection from the dark windows. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized with dawning horror that it wasn't her imagination. There was someone sitting in the back seat of her car. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How long had they been there? How had she not noticed? And what did they want? The figure was barely visible in the dim light, slouched low in the seat, their face obscured by shadows. Katie's heart pounded so loudly in her chest that she thought it might burst. She couldn't breathe. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. She didn't dare turn around. Every instinct told her to drive, to get out of there as fast as possible, but fear kept her paralyzed. She could feel the presence behind her, the silent figure waiting for something, watching her. Without making any sudden movements, Katie reached for her phone, which was sitting on the passenger seat beside her. Her fingers trembled as she tried to unlock it, desperate to dial 911. But before she could finish, a low voice came from the back seat. "Don't." The single word, spoken in a calm, almost conversational tone, sent chills down her spine. Her hand froze mid-motion. She could feel her pulse racing, the blood pounding in her ears. The voice was male, deep and quiet, as though the stranger had all the time in the world. "Just drive," he said. Katie's breath hitched, her body stiff with terror. She wanted to scream, to leap out of the car and run. But she knew that if she tried, he might attack. Whoever he was, he had the upper hand. She was trapped. Her fingers fumbled as she shifted the car into drive, her mind racing. She had to think of a way out, but right now, all she could do was follow his command. She eased the car out of the gas station and back onto the empty highway, her hands shaking on the wheel. For several long minutes, the stranger in the back seat said nothing. Katie kept her eyes glued to the road, trying to stay calm, but her thoughts were a blur of panic and dread. Who was he? How had he gotten into her car? And what was he planning to do? The highway stretched on, dark and empty, the trees on either side like looming shadows. The stranger hadn't moved, hadn't made any further demands, but Katie could feel his presence like a weight in the car. She had to do something, but what? If she made a wrong move, it could end horribly. "I don't want to hurt you," the man said after a while, his voice still low, but now with a hint of menace. "But I will if I have to." Katie's throat was dry. What do you want?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Just keep driving," he said, "and don't try anything stupid." Katie swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. She had to think. There had to be a way out. Her mind raced through possibilities. Maybe there was a town ahead, or a gas station with people who could help. Maybe she could flag down another car, but the road had been empty for miles. As they continued down the dark highway, a plan began to form in her mind. It was risky, but it might be her only chance. Up ahead, the road curved sharply, and Katie knew that just beyond the curve, there was a narrow bridge. If she could accelerate just before the curve and slam on the brakes at the right moment, maybe, just maybe, she could catch him off guard and escape. Her heart pounded as she silently prepared herself. She kept her foot steady on the gas, waiting for the right moment. The bridge was coming up fast. She glanced at the rearview mirror one last time, seeing the shadow of the man sitting motionless in the back seat, unaware of her plan. Just as they approached the curve, Katie pressed her foot down hard on the gas pedal. The car surged forward, the engine roaring as it sped around the bend. The man in the back seat jolted, clearly not expecting the sudden burst of speed. Then, as they reached the bridge, Katie slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, throwing the man forward against the back of her seat. In that split second, Katie flung open her door and scrambled out of the car, her legs shaking as she stumbled onto the side of the road. She didn't stop to look back. She ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she sprinted down the dark road, the cold night air burning in her lungs. She could hear the man behind her, shouting something she couldn't make out, but she didn't care. She just ran, her body fueled by sheer terror and adrenaline. After what felt like an eternity, headlights appeared in the distance. A car was coming. Katie waved her arms frantically, screaming for help as she ran toward the approaching vehicle. The car slowed down, and a middle-aged couple inside rolled down their window, their faces filled with concern. "Are you okay?" the woman asked. There's someone in my car," Katie gasped, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Please help me." The couple quickly led her into their car, and they sped off, leaving her abandoned vehicle and the stranger in the back seat behind. As they drove away, Katie glanced back at her car, now a distant silhouette in the rearview mirror. The man was gone. Katie never found out who he was or what he had planned to do. The police searched the area, but no trace of him was ever found. The only evidence that remained was the deep, unsettling terror that had settled in her bones. For months afterward, Katie would wake in the middle of the night, her heart racing, thinking she could hear the sound of breathing behind her, just like in that dark, lonely car on the highway. And she would never, ever drive alone at night again. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.